first.
Sounds a lot like the Lord talking to Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Say more about
And
that. Okay.
Well, and that's in this where it says, where's Abel your brother?
Okay.
Which of course he obviously knows.
Right. Okay.
But asking Adam and Eve, in the garden after they've eaten of the forbidden fruit,
Yes.
and they're. I don't know, it just reminds me of that same questioning.
Yes. Well, and the same kind of escaping from responsibility, right? Yeah. Yeah. Adam's like, well, she made me do it, yeah, and then she's like, the snake made me do it, so.
Just seems to me, even with the parents, answering a question with a question.
With a question.
God likes to do that a lot. Have you noticed how often Jesus does that? It's a family style.
Yeah. I don't know if he appreciates other people doing that.
Yeah, verse 10 does make it really clear. I heard a group of scholars discussing this, and one person proposed the idea maybe God didn't really know what had happened to Abel. I'm like, come on, verse 10 says he knows,
Right.
But yeah. But God's way of handling it seems to be to first let them take responsibility. And when they fail, then he needs to bring a stronger judgment, unfortunately. These passages are really influenced the way we raise our kids. Our kids know the worst thing they could do is lie. Yeah, because, trust is much harder to rebuild than the car you broke or whatever, right? It's tough.
And that's really true in everything. I mean, if you even look in the secular world, if you look at Nixon and the cover-up, had you just been honest and open, I think more people would have been forgiving.
Yes.
The fact that you try to cover it up, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And then converse to that, if you remember, probably back in the 90s, was it? A certain, some pills had gotten poisoned. And it was Bayer, the company Bayer that was the producer, and they, rather than pointing the finger, obviously it was somebody tampered with it, right? It was arsenic or something insane. What they did was they decided to pull all of the drugs all over the world. All of it's coming off the shelves because we don't know what was affected. And that actually increased people's trust in them. They took more responsibility than they needed to in that situation. So, yeah. Anything else grab you about this one?
It says, and Cain talked with Abel, his brother.
Yes. Interesting to me that... Now, of course, the editors make the decision where they break the text and give it a new paragraph, right? So, in the original, just think about it flowing as one long thing. Is Cain speaking to his brother a follow-up to him talking to God, where God says to him, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it, right? Which, again, that language is reflective, right, of the language that God uses with Eve. We talked about that. That somebody had a different word besides contrary for that passage back in verse 3:16. The second half of the verse, I have it as your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but someone else had it was almost like the opposite. Like your desire will be for your husband.
That's what mine is. Your desire shall be for
yes.
your husband.
So if you, again, think... translations, when the committees do this work, they try to keep the words consistent unless you're dealing with a paraphrase translation, which is why I tell the youth, for instance, you can use a paraphrase translation to try and understand Paul's letters the first time through, because Romans is hard no matter who you are. But to study Romans, you don't use a paraphrase, because these translating committees, if they choose a word to translate a certain Hebrew word, they'll be consistent, and then you'll start to see the patterns emerge from the text. So if you think about that same thing here with what God is saying to Cain in verse 7, sin is crouching at the door, its desire is contrary to you. It also could be translated as its desire is for you.
That's what mine is.
And that's what yours is. So, sin is trying to get him. And why is it trying to? I mean, again, the Hebrew word catches both meanings at once. So they need to make a decision as a translating committee. But sin's desire is to capture Cain, but not for Cain's benefit. It's contrary. Its desire is contrary to what's best for him, right? And you're going to catch that same kind of essence there. So right after that, then Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. Because obviously, Abel is this jealousy thing. Cain's angry, right? And his face fell, we're told. In verse 5, back in verse 5. Why are you angry? Okay. And this language of his face being fallen, turning down, remember that when we start to hear Old Testament passages where it says God will turn away his face from the people. This is not a good thing. Okay? When God turns his face away, he has stopped regarding them. He is, this is a communication of judgment. And here Cain is not able to meet God's gaze. He's angry, right? God is not able to look upon his people when they're sinning in a certain way. And that's actually how the book of Romans pictures God's judgment. It's just God saying, okay, you want it, you can have it. I'm stepping away. That's the worst thing that can happen when God leaves us to our sin. So this language here bounces in. Cain speaking to his brother, is he giving a show of reconciliation? Is he just debriefing with him the way brothers will do? How is that connected to the next sentence? Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Did Abel side with God in this question? I don't know. We're not given all that information, but by including it at the beginning of the paragraph, what that implied to me was that Cain's like, come on, let's go to the field, Abel. Whack, right? Premeditation. Yeah, that's kind of what it was communicating to me. But in the original context, I'm not sure if they made a different editorial decision to tag that at the end of the last paragraph, would I have read it the same way? Because the Hebrew, when you actually see Hebrew printed on a scroll, it's in columns. And it's one letter per column, and it doesn't matter. You have to know how to break the sentences. There's no spaces between the words or anything like that. You're expected to pick up from context the meaning of these words. It's a very early form of writing. And there's new evidence. This is an interesting piece. There's new evidence that Hebrew writing might predate cuneiform, which is really fascinating. They've found some recent, really primitive writing that seems to be Canaanite, related to later Hebrew writing. And I'm trying to remember where it was. It might have actually been in Egypt where they found it. But it would definitely predate cuneiform at that point, which is fascinating because, of course, the oral tradition of the church, or the oral tradition of Judaism, is that Moses wrote the 5 first books of the New Testament. But in order to write them, he would have needed to predate cuneiform. He would have been writing before cuneiform was invented, which we've always, has been traditionally taught as the earliest form of writing. So it's interesting that this new stuff is hotly contested now, you can imagine, because it overturns a lot of people's theories about things. So, but new evidence coming out all the time as we dig up more stuff. And it's important for people to remember that. We tend to think of, when I have discussions with my non-believing friends, they're very into the, the archaeology proves this. They've unearthed less than 1% of the stuff that's there to be unearthed. So we don't know if the most important stuff has even been found yet, In fact, it's a pretty good assumption it hasn't been. Just running the numbers, if it's less than 1%, even in the immediate Jerusalem area alone, less than 1% of it has been unearthed. It's going to be slow-going business, and we don't know what we're going to uncover as we go. And that's not even including the surprise finds, right? So-and-so, some kid chucks a stone into a cave, and all of a sudden we have the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century because he hears a pot break, right? And that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, and all he's doing, he's just bored and throwing stones because he doesn't want to be, chasing a sheep. So So we never know what we're going to find and what it's going to support. So anyway, back to our text. Anything else in these first couple of verses here?
It's as though 10 says, "What hast thou done?"
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the verse before that, it says, "I know not. Am I my brother's keeper?"
Mm-hmm.
And he's not answering the question. He's
Sure.
just like,
No.
Yeah. He's playing the dumb kid.
Yeah.
I don't know where he is,
Yeah.
Mom, you know?
and the Lord knows, of course, is what have you done?
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah. There's a really funny comedian my son listens to out of New York, and he says, you know, the way you give bad news to your parents when you're a little kid?
Yeah.
You run inside and you go, hey, Mom, you know Jimmy, well, his, you know how his arm goes like this? Well, it's not going like that right now.
Not anymore.
And by the way, when you get peanut butter, get smooth. That's how you get bad news to your parents. Yeah. This is just plain dumb.
Yeah.
But this next verse, your cursed is, before that, your voice of your brother's blood is
Yes.
crying out to me from the ground. This is the first inkling we get in Scripture of the importance that blood is going to have to the Jewish people. Okay? The reason why there's special rules for the way you slaughter kosher meat is that life is in the blood. Okay? So you are not entitled to the animal's life when you eat its flesh. Okay? So the Hebrew, this was significant because you realize in most primitive cultures around the world where they don't have enough, I say primitive, just they don't have enough food, they're not necessarily primitive cultures, they're just poor cultures, they will bleed an animal repeatedly to get the protein from the blood, the animal recover. They'll tap, I've seen them do this in Africa, they'll tap the vein in the throat. They'll collect a small bucket of blood, then they'll patch the animal up, and they'll mark it so they know what date they did that, and they know how long it takes for the blood to recycle, and they'll do that and then they'll mix the blood in with like oats or something like this to get additional protein. The Jewish people were not permitted to do that. You're not entitled to the life of the creature. The life belongs to God. Okay, and so blood's going to become really significant. And of course, we as Christians, we talk about the blood of Jesus covering us. It's like a code. And people come in from the outside, they have no idea why we're talking like this. This all goes back to our Jewish roots. The blood is significant. And this is the first time we get an inkling of that. Because the voice of his blood is crying out from the ground. So it's like his voice hasn't been silenced. Cain wanted to silence Abel. Abel's never going to give a better sacrifice than I give again. And now his voice is still speaking. Okay. Anything else?
So does that say that none of us will ever be silenced?
In a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a sense, yeah. That's why there were really serious ethical debates about blood transfusions back in the 19th century when they first started doing them because of these kind of texts. Now, it's different for Christians because we live after the New Covenant, but still, these were significant discussions.
I think it still is for certain religions.
Yes, yeah. Jehovah's Witnesses are not supposed to have blood transfusions, yeah. And I'm not sure about Orthodox Jews. That might be true for them, too. It'd be interesting to find out. So,
Can I ask a question?
of course, by all means.
Probably just random, but it's
No, it's good.
Did they know what happened to Adam and Eve?
I'm sure. Well,
to be kicked out of the garden for predominantly doing the same thing, doing something in their own strength,
right.
and just know in the heart, because the way you said that Cain's thought process was, you're going to be silenced. But God didn't let Adam and Eve get away with it. Why would he let him get away
Right.
with it? So it's just it's not like generations of, you could just hide what I did. You're never going to know what I did, so you won't know that God really does keep his word to keep us straight and narrow. So it's just that's one of the things that I see, even just in today's world, is I know sin, the veil and
Of course,
everything, but still, just doesn't it scare you to just see the repercussions of your choices? And then still do them anyway?
Yeah. I think that's true. We're not told whether Adam and Eve told this story. I would assume they did, because this is part of the family. This becomes, this is a storytelling culture. The traditional cultures all are, right? But also this is how you build wisdom generation to generation and stuff like this. But one of the realities, and I think this is just something we struggle with as human beings, and I feel the Enlightenment has struggled with it more than anyone else, because the Enlightenment's faith was in reason. So once we've solved the problem, being reasonable people once it's fixed, it's fixed. But every generation needs to learn anew. And every generation thinks, those people came before me were idiots. Or at least in the modern world, right? I mean, at least in part. Some of what they did was good, maybe. Mostly it just needs to be burned down and we'll start over, right? And that's the current philosophy going around with critical theory stuff. It all needs to be burned down and we'll start over. What's funny is that it's all this, we'll start over, but I haven't heard the plan for what's going to come after, right? It's just, we know it'll be better than this. Well, do we? Because maybe the people who came before us were trying their best, and this is still as good as they were able to do. And that doesn't mean that they did everything right. It just means that maybe it was the best they were able to do, and maybe we can expect to do no better, especially if we forget the past, if we ignore all that history, right? And that accountability piece, you would think that they would learn from the story of Mom and Dad what it meant to be accountable. And they must know something about God because they're offering him a sacrifice, right? So they've got some kind of relationship with God going on. And this is where that scholar I told you about from Louisiana has helped me a lot. He said, we talk about the fall of humanity, but that's theological code. That's an interpretation of the Bible. It's not what the Bible never uses the word fall. That's just our way of shorthanding it to tell our story more quickly. So he said, when I read Genesis, and again, he's a scholar of that kind of, this is his focus area, is this early Israelite stuff. He says, I see multiple falls. And each one takes humanity a little deeper down. So first you have, Genesis 3 is betrayal of God. Then we're going to have Genesis 4 is betrayal of each other, right? And this is going to get bigger. This is going to get bigger. As you're going to see, as Genesis 4 progresses, we're going to see Cain go off and found the first city. By the time you get to Cain's grandson, he's bragging about how many people he kills. Okay? So it snowballs really quickly. And then, of course, we get the flood story, which is kind of a reset, right? But, of course, the first thing that happens, they get out of the ark, and Noah's son does not good things. Okay. Which we'll get to when we get to. We don't need to anticipate that. All right. So this piece of God hearing the blood of the innocent, that's going to come again and again and again, and the power of blood is going to become central to the way the Israelites practice their faith. Okay. Anything else from these verses? All right, let's do verse 12. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said, did I read that one already? I did read that one already.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about that one? Or I'll read to the end of the paragraph and then we'll talk. We can include 12 if we didn't talk about 12. Okay, 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay, so what are we going to grab onto here?
There's a lot of I in here with Cain.
Yeah.
I can bear. I shall be a fugitive.
Or
I
me.
shall be hidden. you
Right.
know.
Not a lot of, hey, I kind of earned this. Yeah, he's still not being very responsible. He's still not stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility of it for it. There's no repentance.
No.
There's no, I'm sorry I did it. Right? There's just, well, this is a big punishment.
I see a parallel between the ground when he spoke to Adam,
Mm-hmm.
and then again, it's like, what does he mean by that?
Yeah.
Not now, I'm talking about for us today. I
Mhm.
know what he meant.
Sure.
then,
Mhm.
But like, it's like a lot of times, some of the things like I felt growing up. For me, we were in a plural family,
Yes.
and what my mom instilled as a single mother was, she didn't rely on the system.
Mm-hmm.
And for a moment she did when they got divorced, but
Mm-hmm.
she got back into the work field and she supported me.
Right.
And the same thing with my husband's family, they were immigrants
Mhm.
and they had to work
Right.
to support their family. And today, I say the same thing to my children, is you need to work. And I think there's somewhere, I think in Romans that it talks, one of the epistles I have to check, about the value of work.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And he's complaining here. They're not even out of Genesis 3.
Yep.
How many years, centuries later, millennium later?
Yep. Absolutely.
But that, yes, there is a curse in it, but the blessing is when you bear the fruit of your labor.
Yeah.
And that brings us back into communion with the Lord.
Sure. Yeah, the blessing, there's a blessing. In fact, we talked a lot about this as those things that are given in Genesis 3 are prescriptions for our health, not so much punishments for our sins. You know, that it's in doing those things as we live out those judgments that were against us, or live into those judgments, that it excuse me, helps fix us spiritually as we go. Yeah, definitely. I think you're right about that. But I think you're right about the link between there's the talk to Adam about the ground, and then there's the talk to Cain. But especially I would tie this, because if you go back to the beginning of chapter 4, what you see is Cain's a worker of the ground. So he's bringing a botanical offering. Grain, fruit, vegetables, something is what his offering is to God. Abel's a shepherd and brings the firstborn of his flock. Of course, I don't think we keyed in that the same way that the blood thing becomes significant later on. The firstborn becomes significant. The firstborn is consecrated to the Lord. The firstborn is the blessing of the Lord. Okay, to the people, and they're given to the firstborn is given to God in a certain sense. Not in the sense that you necessarily sacrifice them, but they're for the Lord. Okay, that this tying of, say, no longer will the ground yield to you its strength, is directly tied to the fact that that was his vocation. Mm-hmm. It's now the thing he was good at has been taken away. Okay. So it's an amplification, certainly, of the curse that was, or the judgment that was there. I hate to say curse. The judgment that was there against Adam. It's an amplification of that, but it's not the same thing I don't think it's the exact same thing. This is particular to Cain because of what he's done. And because what ultimately made him jealous was he didn't offer the equivalent of the firstborn. The firstborn is what Abel brought, the best of his flock. He didn't bring the first fruits, we would use that language, of the harvest to God. And that's implicit in the text. It doesn't say he brought lousy stuff, but you can read it the way you can read it in the text, and we talked about that. It's pretty evident when you read it carefully. He didn't bring the best stuff, so now he's not going to get anything out of it. It's not going to give back to him. Okay.
Is it because Cain is bringing his own works, something he's done? I get confused on that. I mean, by bringing the whatever it was,
whatever it was, yeah.
Raised.
Mm-hmm.
Is it his work?
I don't know that would be. It's an interesting question. I don't think that's what the focus is. I think the focus is not bringing your best. Okay, so occasionally, out in front of churches, you see these pithy little sayings that pastors try to put up. And one of them, I drove by a church one time that said, "Give God what's right, not what's left." You know, and it's that sort of, what are we giving to God? Are we giving our best, or are we just giving what's left over? Did Cain keep for himself the best, and only did what he did? Oh, I guess I got to do this, instead of looking to God as the source of what he received, and so giving back to God what was there. And this curse from the ground is interesting because, again, the same way that, and this is, I think, another way it's parallel to the Adam and Eve curses, is that we talked a lot about how the judgments against Eve and Adam are indexed to their particular sin. So Adam's sin was neglect. He didn't protect his wife when in a key moment. And so he's given the task of providing again and again and again and again. And it's going to be out labor for him to do so. Eve's transgression was to not listen to the voice of her husband. So now she has to listen to the voice of her husband. And so you have this imbalance where there wasn't supposed to be one before. Because she wasn't there when God gave the instruction, but she knew the instruction through her husband, okay? So it was indexed. The same way here, the ground received the blood of Abel. Now the ground is cursed against Cain, okay? You're cursed from the ground is the way that God says it. Out of the ground comes the curse. So the thing you desecrated will no longer bless you, okay? This becomes a really important spiritual principle going forward in the Old Testament as well. And even in the New Testament, because when they set out to kill Jesus, they're doing the ultimate act of desecration. They're trying to kill God, even if they don't know it. That's what they're doing. And that the amazing part about what God does at the cross is that he inverts the pattern. The pattern that's been true consistently for thousands of years of salvation history, God for one moment turns it upside down. And makes it a blessing to us that we tried to desecrate his ultimate gift, which is his son, his firstborn, right? That's the significance. When you read Colossians, if you get confused when it talks about Jesus being the firstborn, don't think that there's a secondborn. It's that he is the consecrated one. That's what that language means, okay? So that's the piece of it. So this sense of God gave his best to us, and we desecrated it, But because God is as good as he is, as we're going to see when we get into the Abraham story in particular, God is still going to bless us even in the midst of our foolishness and our desecration of his good gifts. So yeah. All right. Now, because the land will no longer yield its strength, he's going to be a fugitive and a wanderer. He's going to have to eat, essentially by begging, what we would call a mendicant, or he's going to have to go place to place, and no longer will he be able. Because as a farmer, you stay in one place. You live with the land through its seasons and its rhythms. But now, he's not going to be able to eat if he stays in one place. Now he's going to have to wander. Okay. What else?
What does verse 16 mean? When Cain went away from the presence of the Lord.
I think it's a parallelism. Jewish stories are told with parallelisms. You'll see Jesus do this a lot. In fact, the word parable, we use the word parable. That's parabolein in Greek. It literally means to lay down next to. So you take two ideas and lay them down next to each other. And so you can get wisdom out of seeing the two things side by side. Okay. Jewish stories are told with parallelism. So what we have at the end of this story is what we call the expulsion from Eden, right? They leave Eden, and an angel with a flaming sword guards their way back. Here, we have another expulsion from the presence of God. So even though they were no longer in Eden, we see that there's still interaction with God in Genesis 4, because God's talking to Cain, So even though they're no longer in the place where everything is provided, there's still a much more intimate interaction with God than we anticipate, or that we see later on. And this is why I think this guy from Louisiana, his idea of a series of falls, where the situation keeps getting worse for humanity as we go, I think is a reasonable reading of the text. And it's interesting here when we get to verse 14. Cain mirrors back to God his own language. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer. God says to him, you'll be a fugitive and a wanderer. I can't take it. I'm going to be a fugitive and a wanderer. You know? So what else grabs you? No one's gonna ask the question the kids asked me this morning.
It says, and that everyone that findeth me shall slay me.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Ah, that's the question. That's the question the kids asked.
So
Okay.
why is God going to protect him?
Let's get to that. Let's do those questions in order.
Okay.
Okay. So let's start with, what is it? What do you mean when you say what does it mean?
What does it mean? Everyone that comes here, you can only get slaved once, right? You're going to die once.
True. Mm-hmm.
How many people? It says everyone that findeth me shall slay me.
Okay. Yeah. And my translation says whoever finds me. I think that's more an Old English thing.
Yeah,
Everyone who
yeah.
finds me. I think that's just a way of. I think that's the way the language has drifted in for 400, 500 years. Yeah, my translation says whoever finds me will kill me. So someone will slay me.
So he lives in fear for the rest of his life. Is
Right.
that it?
That's why his sense of things is the punishment is too great to bear.
See, I thought the punishment of not raising produce was too great to
Well,
bear.
that too. I mean, but this is the punishment for it. Is that a landless person is a problem in the ancient world, right? If you find somebody wandering, that means they were cast out of their tribe, and there's a reason. You don't know the crime, but you know they're guilty. Okay, of something, and something serious, because they were expelled from the tribe.
Wow.
No one's going to ask who these other people are.
Yes.
So that's the question the kids asked me. They're like, I thought there were only like 4 people. Who are all these other people? This is going to establish a really important principle, particularly for reading Genesis. Our young creationist brothers and sisters in the faith will say that, okay, what you got is you got Adam, God takes the ribs, and so you get Eve, and then out of those 2 you get Cain and Abel, and that's me spelling too badly. This thing bounces at such a pain. Okay, so then Abel gets killed, and then they of course come up with Seth. Right. So they count at this point in history. Our young creationist brothers and sisters count 5 people. So who are all these other people who are going to kill Cain?
And where did they come from?
Well, and this is the principle I want to get at. The book of Genesis tells the story of God's people, not the story of all people. Okay, that's really important. It is not intended to be a comprehensive history of all humanity, apart from the creation story. Okay, there are other people out. Who do they marry? That was the other question. That's the other question. Who do they marry? Because it says they marry. There have to be other people who marry. Okay. So what we don't know, if you want to go with a young Earth creationist view, and that's okay. If you want to go with that, they have other children we're not told about. Okay, and they marry one of their sisters. Okay, or Adam and Eve this represents the telling of. We talked about this a little bit. You missed this, Lisa. The way chapter 2 describes Eden, it doesn't look like a physical place on a map. It looks like a spiritual place, for lack of a better word. So we can't find it on a map. So does that make it a particular genre? And this is what William Lane Craig, who's one of the greatest apologists of our generation, probably the greatest apologist of our generation, has done more to make Christianity understandable and talk about it with people who disagree, people who are atheists. He has tons of debates. He's been doing this for 35, 40 years, and he's a brilliant guy. He has a doctorate in philosophy as well as theology, so he's got 2 doctorates. He released a book, probably within the last 12 months, where it's a lot of people who he was their hero, he's not their hero anymore, because he says that the first 11 chapters of Genesis looks to him like a particular genre, and it's called mytho-history. Now, this is not invented by him. This was actually came out of, you know what an Egyptologist is, right? An Egyptologist studies Egypt. Well, an Assyriologist studies Assyrian. Okay, so there's a guy, I can't remember his name now, he was a really famous Assyriologist. Right, what he started to recognize was that in the way that the Assyrians told stories, they told real history, but they told it in a way that made the story applicable morally beyond the particular story itself. Okay, and this is what made it mytho-history. It's not that they're telling a falsehood; they're telling real history, but they're telling it with some sort of bells and whistles, for lack of a better word, to make it like, say, from time out of memory, we know that this is the way it works. And so you want your kids to learn the moral story. The equivalent for us, roughly, would be the Brothers Grimm and their fairy tales. Do any of us ever believe there was a Little Red Riding Hood who encountered a wolf dressed up like grandma? No. But we tell that story because we want the kids to learn the lesson that's involved in that, right? Or Hansel and Gretel, or whatever. Was there a historical Hansel and Gretel? I don't know. There were probably two kids who wandered off with the wrong person and got murdered. You know, so that's what William Lane Craig's theory is. I think his theory is too big. I don't think it fits for all of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, but I think it works really well for Genesis 2 and 3. I do think, Genesis 1 is clearly poetry. I mean, it's a big hymn. You know, it's a big story describing how God built His temple. We talked about that. You missed it. The genre that it is recognizable from other comparative stories in the ancient world, where they're building a temple to the God. In this case, God is the one constructing His own temple, and He puts the image in the end by putting in Adam and Eve. So the story is being told in a way that would make it intelligible to other people, even though it's the Jewish story, which is very different than the other creation stories. I do think that by the time you get to this story of Cain and Abel, I think the connection to Adam and Eve is real. I think there's other people in the story for them to marry. I don't have to invent people to bring them in. Now, we're to get to the Nephilim, and that's a completely different category. The Nephilim are not these other people. Okay, we'll get to that in a little while. But there are other people groups surrounding them at this point, and that's what he's afraid of. He's afraid of being murdered because he's been cast out of the camp. Okay? And so what's going to happen is, of course, Cain is supposed to... Now, here's, again, something significant maybe we didn't talk about last time at the beginning of chapter 4. Who is Cain? He's the firstborn. Okay? His name, when Eve says, you know, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord, the word Cain sounds like Hebrew for gotten, like I got. Okay? He's supposed to be the child of the blessing. And by murdering Abel, he loses the blessing. And so Seth is going to become the child of the promise. Okay? This is going to get paralleled down the road with Jacob and Esau. Okay? So, yeah, this, again, what you see, and this is what makes this ring so true to me, whether you take it as mythological history, and that's important. It's not mythology. This isn't Odin and Zeus and the gods. This is telling a story in a particular way. Or whether you take it as literal history, it's so true that family patterns repeat generation to generation. You just see it happen. And it even gets picked up in the Ten Commandments. God talks about it, you know, that the curse will continue for 3 and 4 generations. But if you do the right thing, it continues for 1,000 generations. But you see these dysfunctional patterns that repeat again and again and again. I'm a child of an alcoholic. You see it again and again and again, you know. Mine is the skip it generation. But my kids have grown up with the story. Understand that it could happen to you, you know. So be careful. In any event, but you see this pattern getting repeated. So God's going to say to him, let's look at the particular case now of this. How does Cain do this? My punishment is greater than I can bear, he says. So he's talking back to God. Behold, you've driven me away from the ground, Interesting how he says this. You've driven me away from the ground. Still not taking responsibility. Which is Adam all over, right? The woman you gave me. It's your fault, God. If you didn't give me this woman, I'd have been fine, right? I mean, this is it's almost comical. Yeah, if it wasn't so direly serious, it would be comical. And God says that you're cursed from the ground. It's almost like the ground curses him. It's not even like God's doing this, right? So Cain's putting all the blame on God. You've driven me away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. Now that he knows is a bad thing.
Yeah, that's bad.
He knows it's bad to be hidden from God's face, okay? And then he repeats this, I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So to be looked at by God, now that's important language, to be regarded. Okay, that's what that means. So hidden, when someone turns their face towards you, it means they have a regard for you. That's an older, I mean, my family loves Jane Austen. We read a lot of her and watch a lot of, what do you call them, costume dramas and stuff like this. That you have at the moment of her best love story is Pride and Prejudice. All her stories are love stories, but her best one's Pride and Prejudice, in my estimation. And in the big moment of his confession, Mr. Darcy finally says to Elizabeth, I've come to have a passionate regard for you. I've looked upon you and I see you as you are, and love you for it. And this is that language of, you don't want to be hidden from somebody's face. You don't want their face turned away from you. That's why when Cain turns his face away from God, when his face falls, he's not looking for God's. In his anger, he's not looking for God's approval anymore. So he's turning away from God. Now he knows the terror of what's going to happen if God turns away from him. Okay. Now we can get to your question about why does God protect him. In the same way, here's the parallelism in the stories. In the same way, when he curses the snake, he includes the blessing that the snake will get the offspring of the woman's heel, but the offspring will crush his head. God always includes a blessing in the judgment. Okay? So here's the parallelism. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. So he will still be protected, even though his distance from God will be further. No longer in Eden, first of all. Now a fugitive and a wanderer from the land even. God will still be with him in some way. Now we're going to see in just a few chapters or paragraphs, we'll be told. This is when people started to call upon the name of the Lord. So the distance is significant. There's no longer interaction with God in this way. So now Cain is going to have to trust that God's protecting him, even though he has no experience of God. He's going to have no more talking with God as we go forward. Okay? So again, in the judgment is the prescription to get well. He didn't trust God. Now he's going to have to trust God, even when he's not getting feedback from him. And what was God's last injunction to him before this? If you do well, will you not be accepted? So do well. This is now. Remember that sin is crouching at the door, and it mastered you. You killed your brother. This is the reflections that are going through Cain's head as he goes off, and we'll see what he's going to do. Because he's been driven off the land, he takes a different tact on how to survive. The thing about this, I've read these stories so many times. This is why I wanted to do a Bible study with them. When you slow down the text this much, there's so much richness in these old texts because they were so dense. They encoded so much information in so little prose that you really have to slow down to see all the dynamics of what's going on. And this is why it's taken generations of rabbis and teachers years and years to do it. It's why the one unique genre to Christianity and Judaism that I don't think we find in other religions prior to them. Now, there have been some religions that have imitated us since. But even in scholarship, we don't see commentaries. Commentaries on the scriptures are a massive genre, a massive body of literature by the time Jesus comes along. Okay? These are the Talmud and the Mishnahs and all these things you hear. These are commentaries on the scriptures. And Christians will pick that up right away, and they'll start writing their own commentaries on the scriptures. And in fact, they'll write commentaries on other things. So by the time you get to the Middle Ages, you'll see all these Christian commentaries on all the classic stories. The Iliad, the Odyssey. There's tons of Christian commentaries on the Iliad. They're not regarding them as scripture. It's not that kind. But they're digging into the text to see what we can learn from it by slowing the text down. And this is a good time to introduce a word to you if you don't know it. Good commentaries on any text, not just scripture, but predominantly scripture, are called exegesis. And you can get the EX at the beginning, like external, or it means outside. So you're reading out of the text. That's good. You want to find what's in the text and pull it out. Okay. The opposite is eisegesis, and that's bad practice. Reading into the text, finding what you want to find there. The reason why the massive culture war is going on right now, in part, is because since a group of guys called the French post-structuralists in the mid-20th century came to the conclusion there was no such thing as exegesis. There was only eisegesis. All you were doing when you read was trying to read your own views into it and read your own advantage into it. This became super dominantly popular in our universities. So if the claim is there's no such thing as this, all you have is your own history and your own stuff. So it's that notion that, the victors write the histories kind of stuff, right? History's written by the winners of the wars, whatever. So it's saying there is no such thing as actually reading the text or history or anything else to find out what's really there. All you have is reading into it what you want to do. So, an example of this would be the 1619 Project, which has been roundly criticized by responsible scholars for poor use of sources, invention of ideas by creative editing. So there's and Harold Zinn is the guy who started this work with his what's his name of his history? A People's History of America. So it's a socialist interpretation, a Marxist interpretation of history. But he's notorious for doing things like 5 pages of text by Christopher Columbus, take a sentence at the beginning and a sentence at the end and push them together, make it look like one quote. So that it completely, by skipping the middle pages, you changed completely what he was saying. Deliberately taking things out of context to tell the story I want to tell. Because that's, after all, what we're all doing. We're just telling the story we want to tell. But, and this comes from drifting away from Christianity in part. Judaism and Christianity both said you can't do eisegesis. This is the hallmark of bad preaching, bad scholarship, bad church. Okay? Exegesis is what we're to find what's in the text and nothing else, and not read into it our own readings.
At that point, there's no absolutes.
Precisely, and that's what the post-structuralists wanted. This is going to be. I apologize for the language here, but one of the big guys was a guy named Foucault, and he said the problem with Western culture was this. Was that it was phallogocentric. They like to invent words, right? Well, but you can see logos right at the center, right? When we say the Word became flesh, when we read John 1:1, when we say the Word became flesh, that's the Word, God's Word. So he's saying the problem with Western culture was that it was about men, it was focused on objective truth. So that's what that was what they needed to tear down. So the whole project has been to unseat, in his interpretation, it was all just he was a really strident homosexual. So it was straight men seeking objective truth. That was the problem. That's the whole history of Western culture. We've summed it all up in one word, and that's what needs to be torn apart. So when you see people right now saying we just need to burn it all down, that's what they're addressing. It's that stuff. Okay, that's how they think they're going to make the world better. if someone else tells the story, it'll instantly be better. We can count on that. Well, first of all, it's not only ridiculously simplistic, it's not true. Lots of people contributed to that history who are not straight men. But the search for objective truth, I think to say that that's only a white straight thing is the most insulting thing you could possibly ever say. I mean, I think Confucius was seeking truth. I think, Augustine was African. I mean, this is not, it's silly on the face of it, but this is what ideology can do. It can blind you. To things. I know we're at a little afternoon now, so I don't want to notice too long. The sevenfold piece, just keep in mind for Judaism, 7 is the perfect number. So it means that by saying sevenfold, it means I'll avenge you perfectly. So God's protection is still over him, even as he's going out. He won't do much good with that, as we're going to get into in the next couple of paragraphs. But you're going to see the last thing I want to draw your attention to here is that Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay. Okay. The main thing I want you to focus on in that I want to draw your attention to in that last one is this language east of. Okay. Just forget it. East. So the S starts with me. Okay. East of. When you're traveling east, it's a symbol of exile. Okay. That's again, especially if Eden is not a physical place on a map. At least the way Genesis 2 tells us. And part of it is like it's funny because I've watched people try to graph it. They almost always graph it really like try to find a physical place. It's right near the ocean. How do you go east from the ocean? If the ocean's east, there's no way to do that, But even if there was a physical location that this is indexed to, in the way the story is told, to travel east from that place means to be in exile. Means to have to not have the blessing you had in the place you were in. Okay, and it's going to be interesting because all this pattern starts to get reversed in the Christmas stories, right? So when we sing "We Three Kings," they're coming from the east, coming west to find the Christ child. Okay, Joseph is going to take the Christ child west into Egypt to escape from Herod. So that's an indication that things are starting to reverse. It's the equivalent, for those who love the C.S. Lewis stories, it's the equivalent of hearing Aslan's on the move. Okay? We've heard a rumor, God's doing something different. But that's a reversal of the whole pattern we're going to see here because they're carried east into Babylon in exile. Going east is always a bad thing. And the pattern's going to get reversed as we move into the New Testament. So. All right, we'll end it there for today.